All right, today we're going to look at an introduction to world geography. My first question for you is basically, what is geography? Geography is the study of the earth. Literally, it's the study of place and space. Geographers look at where things are and why are they at those places. Beyond just looking at maps, geographers also study how it is that human activity interacts with the natural environment. So it's more than just where something is, it's how do people interact with what's out there. So what do we do as geographers? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to observe. We have to look at the world, catalog it, and map it. We're looking for patterns. We're looking for similarities. This is where we're going to get ideas like culture and region. We're going to look at relationships between these different regions and examine spatial patterns from a political perspective. The big questions you're going to ask: where is something? Why is it there? And where and why do we care about it? The first thing most of us think about when we think of geography is physical geography. Physical geography includes the rocks and the minerals, the landforms on the Earth's surface, the actual physical parts of the Earth you can touch, the animals and the plant life, including us. What are the soils like? What is the atmosphere, the climate, and the weather like? What is the general environment of an area? And we look at more than just the land, we look at the water. We look at the rivers, the oceans, the lakes. All of this is part of our physical geography. Even more interesting than physical geography is cultural geography. Cultural geography is more the study of the why than the what. Cultural geography looks at population patterns. Where do people live? Why do people live near the water rather than up in the mountains? Why are there more people along the eastern coast of North America than in the Himalayas? We look at economic and political systems. When people establish a government, what does that government look like? We look at transportation issues. Geographers are the people that solve these issues. We've got to get people from point A to point B. What's the most efficient way to do this? How do people actually use their transportation systems? We look at migration patterns of animals and people. Human migration is a very big deal to geographers. Why are people leaving one area and going to another, and where are they going to go next? This is going to be important to us when we try and figure out how do we use our resources properly. We look at social systems and recreation. We look at religion, extensively at religion around the world. What do they have in common? We look at belief systems, because our political systems, our economic systems, our religious systems, our belief systems, these are what make us human beings. These are also what make us fight wars. So we always wonder, what exactly do geographers do? If you were a geographer and you went looking for a job, what could you do? Well, you could be a cartographer, somebody that makes a map. We all know that. But you could also be what we call a location analyst. A location analyst analyzes the population patterns in an area and the resources that are available, and they determine where would be a good spot to put our resources. Places like McDonald's and Burger King and shopping malls and even new schools use location analysts to determine where exactly the right place is to put these things. Because if you put them in the wrong place, the business is going to fail. If you put a school in the wrong place, it's not going to meet the needs of the students. If you put a highway in the wrong place, people aren't going to use that highway. There's also environmental scientists and consultants. These are people that look at the effect that our business has, our economy has on the environment, and they consult with you. Maybe it's not a good idea to fill in that wetland because you're going to prevent water from refilling the aquifers. Maybe it's not a good idea to cut down the rainforests and prevent the oxygenation of the world. The rainforest is the Earth's lungs. If we cut those things down, we won't have enough oxygen. It's environmental scientists and consultants that do this. And sometimes they're not super popular. Here in East Texas, if you want to sell some timber off, you probably don't like the environmental consultants coming out and looking to see if you have that rare breed of red-hooded woodpecker. Because if you do, they're going to say you can't cut those trees down. But this is their job. It's to protect the geography that we have. We also have urban and regional planners. They use GIS, Global Information Systems. This is computer mapping of the Earth. And again, they're using it to try and determine the best way to use their limited resources. And sometimes how we lay out a city is going to be important as to how effective or efficient it is, not only in moving people, but in using our resources. You don't want to put a giant city in the middle of the desert with no source of water. A GIS person can map the Earth and determine the best places to put these things. Real estate and development analysts are also geographers. If you're planning on building a subdivision or building an apartment complex, you don't want to do it in an area that's not growing. But geographers can look at all this information and determine where the next big boom is going to be. And if you can get ahead of the game a little bit there and get your apartment complex or your condominiums or your subdivision in there before everybody moves in, you're in a good place to make a lot of money. So you need geographers for that. There's transportation and tourism planners. They use geographers extensively in order to determine the best way to move people in and out of an area. When's the best time to do it? How are we going to map things through? This is what different mapping programs, Google Maps, Apple Maps, all of these programs, Waze, if you've ever used that, they're looking at how people are moving, and they'll actually reroute people in order to stop congestion. That's a geographer's job. And of course, you can also be a school teacher in public schools, private schools, or universities, where you could teach geography or physical geography. Every discipline has its own classification systems. In biology, they talk about taxonomy, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We all know that from our science classes. In geology, they talk about geological time. In history class, we talk about eras, ages, periods, time frames. But geographers look for what we call geographic regions. A geographic region is an area that shares something in common, whether it be a physical characteristic or a human characteristic. Physical characteristics mean they have something in common in landforms, in climate, in vegetation, while a human or a cultural characteristic means they have something in common on the human aspect. They share a common language or a common religion or a common food, a common ethnicity, a common population center. There's something there that links those. And each of us is part of a lot of different human characteristic regions. Let's talk about geographic regions for a minute. Geographic regions can actually change over time as the Earth's geography changes. And over a very, very vast, long period of time, the Earth has changed many, many times as plates have moved, as weather patterns and climate has changed. The Earth has changed. Well, geographic regions will change over time, and they don't have definitive borders. We can argue about what the geographic border of an area is. In fact, almost all of them have what we call a transition zone between them. This is an area that has a gradual shift from one region to another. It's not a sharp break. You don't go from desert to plains and there's a line there where the desert stops and the grass starts. Instead, it gradually adjusts from a desert to a steppe, to a meadows, to a full prairie grassland. These are what we call our transition zones. Now, the criteria that we use to determine a region changes over time, and it's determined by human needs. This allows us to compare one region with another. But again, it doesn't mean that because you belong to one region, you don't belong to another. Every region has certain properties. They all have a somewhat defined area. This is the part of the region that we recognize. Think of in our own, right here in Texas, we belong to a bunch of regions. We belong to the Piney Woods, that's a cultural region. We belong to East Texas, that's kind of a physical geographic region. We belong to Cherokee County, Texas, in the United States. Those are all political regions, but they all have boundaries to it. So just because you're part of one region doesn't mean you're not part of multiple regions. These regions also have boundaries. Now the boundaries can shift. We've seen this a lot of times. If you're from the South, you've heard the argument a lot of times, what states are included in the South? Some places think Texas isn't the South. And if you go way out to West Texas, you might agree with that. So these boundaries, they're kind of fluid. And they all have a location. By location here, what I mean is not, not telling us what something's like. It's telling us its measured place. There's absolute location and there's relative location. If your absolute location is your specific measured spot on the earth, your latitude and longitude. Your relative location is, what are you near? Give you an example here. Here in Wales, if I was to give the absolute location of Wales, I could say it's 12 miles south of Alto on Highway 69. You could leave Alto, you could drive 12 miles, you'd find Wales. That's a measured location, it's an absolute. If I was to give you the relative location of Wales, I'd say it's roughly between Lufkin and Alto. Well, that gives you a relative idea. Now, we've already touched on this when we talked about regions, but every region also has sub-regions in it. Sub-regions can be based on physical features or they can be based on human characteristics. Again, the United States is part of the North American region. So we could say that the U.S. is a region of North America. But inside North America, we have a bunch of regions as well. We got the Northeast, the South, the Midwest, the Pacific Rim, the Gulf Coastal Plain, the Great Plains. All of these areas are sub-regions of the United States. So you can be part of more than one. When we talk about regions and sub-regions, we're basing this on a couple of criteria. First off, we look at its human properties or its cultural properties. We say, well, the people of the United States have a common government. They have roughly a common religion. Most Americans consider themselves Judeo-Christian, although by no means all. They have a common language. So those are our cultural properties. We also have physical properties. We go, well, it's on the North American plate. It's between Canada and Mexico. That kind of tells us. And sometimes it can be both. Something can be based on both its human properties and its physical characteristic. Think of France. France is a nation with borders. It's got specific areas. It's the English Channel, Germany, Spain. It's all right there, kind of surrounded by these other countries. But it's also got some cultural ideas. The people there speak French. Traditionally, they're Roman Catholic, although not so much anymore. There's a certain kind of food that's seen there. So France is recognized as a cultural region and a physical region. There's a couple of ways that we can define these regions for classifications. One is a region that's dominated by one political power, and the other is a region that has no dominant state. North America is usually put down as a region that is dominated by the United States, although I think that's starting to be questioned as Canada and Mexico are becoming more and more important. But North America includes Canada, Mexico, the United States, but still the one political power of the United States kind of dominates it. Middle America, dominated by Mexico, if you take all of Latin America. South America may or may not be dominated by Brazil. What we call the Russian realm, the area up there, Northern Asia, is dominated by Russia, even though there's many, many countries there. East Asia is dominated by China, South Asia by India, the Australian realm dominated by Australia. These are all areas that have one country that dominates, but that's not at all true everywhere. Europe has no dominant state. Europe has England, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, all these different countries out there, and no one state dominates the other. In fact, they've come together as a European Union, where they're kind of creating their own version of the United States there. Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, both not controlled by any dominant state anymore, although they once were. North Africa was once controlled by Egypt, but today it's not. As a legacy of colonialism, Africa has a bunch of states. And of course, Oceania, what we call the Pacific realm, that's all those little islands out, mostly in the Pacific Ocean. No dominant state in that area, but they are still regional classifications. We have formal regions out there, which is an area, again, is a region that's marked by a degree of lightness in one or more of these different groups. The definition of this is one or more phenomena. That just means there's one or more things that make this area alike. Latin America is a good example. Latin America is, includes Mexico, which is part of North America, all the way down into South America. But it's called Latin America because it was settled mostly by the Spanish and the Portuguese. They spoke a Latin language. They tended to be settled by people of Catholic religions, and they share this kind of common characteristic. The next type of region is called the functional region. Functional region is an area that's marked by its functional structure. It's something that's organized around a set of interactions and connections between places. Metropolitan areas are a great example of this. Think about the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. All of the little towns and cities that surround the two giants of Dallas and Fort Worth are all considered part of the Metroplex because there's interaction with business between them. It doesn't matter if you're in Dallas or Fort Worth or Richardson or Arlington or Grand Prairie or Denton or wherever you are in that area. You're part of the Metroplex. In fact, a lot of times I'll hear people say, I'm going to Dallas this weekend. I go, really, where are you going? Well, I'm going to Arlington. I'm going to go to a football game. Well, you're not really going to Dallas. You're going to the Metroplex. That's a functional region. A perceptual region is a little harder to define. It's an area where people perceive that they have characteristics they share with other people in their area. Whether they do or not, whether they're really different or not, they perceive this. Think of the American Midwest or even the American South, Dixie, where we have this perception of us being different than the Northeast. We're not Yankees, we're different down here. These perceptual regions can be very, very important to us. Sometimes they can lead to divisions. Sometimes they can even lead to civil wars, as they have in Northern Ireland and England, the United States between the North and the South, Spain between the Spanish and the Basques, the Ukraine between the Ukrainians and the Russians. These are perceptual regions that have exploded into civil war. What is the most common, most useful tool for a geographer? Well, it's a map. And a map could be any number of things. I could draw you a map on a sheet of paper, and that would still be a map. I could go grab my globe over there. That's a map. I could pull up MapQuest or Google Maps or Apple Maps. That's a map. But this is the simplest way that we can understand things. And it's very misleading at times, because you're taking a three-dimensional world and you're trying to show it on a two-dimensional objects. It can lead to some pretty difficult ideas that we'll get to a little later on. There's several different types of maps. There's physical maps. Physical map tells us what the land is like. Physical map will tell you where the deserts are, where the mountains are, where it's cold, where it's hot. There's political maps, which have the hard outlines of political states. These are the ones that show you where the United States and Canada and Mexico are. And there's other maps that blend all these together. We also have special purpose maps. We'll have maps that show population density. where we call these cartograms, where the more people that live in a place, the larger it appears. They'll look quite a bit different than what we see in a regular map. We can have infant mortality maps or literacy maps or gross domestic product maps that tell us which countries produce the most goods. Maps tell us a great deal about the world, and they're a super important tool to us. Every map has a few good parts. The tool that we use to understand a map is called TodalSigs, TODALSIGS. This is a bad acronym, but it's an acronym that we can remember. When you're looking for a map, a good map will always have all of these things. First off, a title. The title should tell you what the map is about. This is the first place you look on a map. If it says it's a political map, it's going to give you hard, defined political lines. If it says it's a physical map, it's going to tell you what the Earth is like. Next, you look for the orientation of the map. Which way's north? Doesn't do you much good if you can't figure out where you were on the Earth's surface. If we look at old maps, frequently they weren't oriented like our maps are. North might be down and to the left. It might be due south to us. We don't know. We need to know which way this map is oriented. They should always include a date. This may not seem like it would be important because, I mean, it's the Earth. How often does the Earth change? Well, politically, it changes a lot. Right here in my classroom, I have a couple of globes here, that if you were to use those globes to identify the nations of Asia, and then particularly in Africa, you'd have a tough time with it because of civil war and shifting border changes. Those nations aren't right anymore. So we need that date so we know exactly how accurate and up to date this map is. The author would be helpful to us sometimes. We want to know if that map is made by somebody that we can trust, or was that map made as a tool to try and get a political agenda forward. Sometimes we'll see maps that are simply not accurate. For instance, if you go to Israel and you look at a textbook in Israel, you can see a map that shows where the modern country of Israel is. But if you go into the part of Israel that's called Palestine, the Palestinian homeland, where the Palestinians run the schools, Israel's not on the map because they don't recognize it as a country. It still says Palestine. So knowing who put that information out could be useful to us. You need a legend. The legend is basically the key that tells us how to read the map. And you need a scale so you can determine exactly how large something is. You can be very misleading if you don't have a scale. An index is useful so you can look up a specific location. If it's got a grid square system, it's a whole lot easier to use, like latitude and longitude. And you'd like to have the source. Where did this information come from? Is it something that we can, is it something that we can trust? A grid system is super important to a map. A grid system is just a series of horizontal and vertical lines that intersect with each other. And it allows us to identify exactly where something is. They may use numbers and letters or a series of numbers. Maybe across the top they'll have numbers and down the side letters. Or sometimes we'll use like what we use with the latitude and longitude system, which uses a series of numbers identified with cardinal directions. So you have north, south, east, and west. And you're numbered north of the equator or south of the equator and east and west of the prime meridian. Your lines of latitude, sometimes called parallels, are these lines that run horizontally along the globe or the map. What these actually do is they measure distance north and south of the equator. So they run east and west, but they measure north and south. And then there's longitude lines. Longitude lines are long. They go up and down, long and flat, okay? Longitude up and down. They run vertically around the globe or the map, and they're either east or west of the prime meridian. And again, they measure distance east and west. So if you have these numbers, you can very quickly identify where something is.